Chances are, if you've watched any of the prolific anime from the pre-2000s, you noticed some similar themes and topics. There's connection between beings, psychological explorations of the characters, memory and its true boundaries, the next stage of human evolution, and even more trippy topics. Most notably, you may hear a quite clear direct mention of the collective unconscious. Information stored in the primordial nature of human beings, genetic information paving the way of our future, the breakdown of barriers between not just us and our history, but each other and even our own selves. This is a theory posited by Jarl Jung, a Sigmund Freud contemporary, and the ideas these two bounced off of each other in the early 20th century left a profound impact on the landscape of the late 20th century anime industry. Yes, actually. From Evangelion to Lain and Akira to Ghost in the Shell, these series and movies have much more in common than just the time when they were made. By looking at the thoughts of these two controversial figures, we'll be able to gain insight not just on these anime we all know and love, but ourselves and the nature of human beings on the whole. This is the first part of a potential series on the subject. Today we'll be covering the collective unconscious and how it's portrayed in Serial Experiments Lain, before we tackle Freud and Neon Genesis Evangelion's take on similar topics, followed by some multiple anime videos which will relate back to both, with at least Ghost in the Shell and Akira. I hate to split this up, but making a 3-hour-long video not knowing if it would do well is a bit much for my current schedule. So for those other videos to be made, this one will have to perform well. So use those usual features to let our algorithmic overlord know it should push the video a little bit more, but also so I can see your thoughts on the topics we'll be covering. Trust me, it'll be a very fitting idea for everyone to give their own take on the subject, and of course I always love to see them all. Maybe in the next video of this series I can include some screenshots of really good comments since it'll be a continuation. We'll have to see how that goes. But we've wasted enough time already. Be warned, there's spoilers ahead for Serial Experiments Lain, but let's get into it. Now, all of what we're about to cover starts with a heavy warning. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung are controversial figures in the world of psychology for a reason. Most of the ideas they put forward were conjecture based on observation. If we think of scientific study today, we'd witness a phenomena and develop an experiment to see what did or didn't cause it with rigorous standards to ensure that the only variables which changed are the ones which we choose so an accurate conclusion could be drawn. For example, say you're conducting a taste test between two similar products. Only a small section of each one would be used so that there's no distinguishing characteristics, so that size or shape plays no influence on the participant's perception. With any extraneous distinctions, they may be inclined to have an unconscious bias. Those two men, however, on the other hand, had a process more akin to observing the phenomena and then wildly posturing as to what caused it. They recognized actual principles which are still studied to this day. However, they did little work in providing an accurate cause for them. For example, take a study with 4 participants where 3 are really actors answering simple questions. When the actors pick a clearly incorrect answer, the actual subject is more likely to as well, even against their better judgment. Freud and Jung may have witnessed this and deduced that psychic, unconscious, mysterious forces were at play, unknown to us humans, controlling us and communicating unconsciously through something like ESP. In reality, it's more accurate to say that, well, it's probably just evolution. Species which agree with each other more will be more cohesive, so inclined to stick with the group and agree, in addition to the complex web of social pressures that surround all of us. As such, the work of this pair falls much more under the umbrella of philosophy rather than psychology, and that's how we'll be treating it here today, because I think there's some value in the consideration, if nothing else. In the same way that the randomness of the universe could be called God, all of these actual principles we're witnessing could technically be proof of some unconscious or greater force of which we're unaware, and simply witnessing a multitude of effects from. Now, is this likely in any way whatsoever? No, not at all. And as an unfalsifiable theory, it won't be worthwhile for scientific pursuits, but it could offer us interesting thought experiments in the same way that narrative does, as well as being a good exercise in considering aspects outside of our usual conceptions. So don't take what these two said, often under the influence of heavy drug use, as actually psychological evidence. But let's see what kind of philosophical considerations they could reveal to us. Now, the idea we're most concerned with is Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, but to cover that, we'll first have to briefly lay the groundwork of what the unconscious is. Now, these two believed it to be sort of a mystical force, these repressed thoughts we can't access, things of that nature, but really, in short, it's the processes of our mind that we're unaware of. While I'm speaking, I'm actively considering the words being said, and when I was writing them, I was recalling my memory of what I had researched. Information in our mind, even if it must be recalled actively like memory, is conscious. The unconscious would be that which isn't an active process we decide to take. As I'm speaking, I don't think about how to move my mouth to make each sound, it just happens. Something like muscle memory is unconscious. You don't think yourself through speaking once you learn how to, you just do so. That's very brief, but it's the basic necessities needed to address Jung's collective unconscious. The concept is exceptionally abstract, not just in its implications, but in its definitions as well. As such, different sources will provide somewhat altered explanations, and what I'm presenting here is as best as I've understood it myself. Roughly, it is the unconscious of an entire species, including the leftovers of ancestor species inherited by each individual. Within it are specific patterns of thought, common ideas, images, or similar things called archetypes. These influence and determine our behavior and thoughts under certain conditions, so they could be called dispositions to act a certain way. Yes, it is extremely abstract, so it may be best to think of it as simply a collective pool of information that we pull from without awareness. The most given example would be something like a social role, a mother or a father. Across multiple cultures across the world, these roles exist and play out in similar ways, even before our modern age of easy information sharing. So the reasoning he had is that the idea of these roles exists somewhere in the collective, and when the conditions are met for someone to embody them, i.e. in this example, having a child, they will pull on that information which then directs their behavior. It's also reasoned as the cause of similarities in myths or legends between cultures, which are claimed to be expressions of the collective unconscious itself. That's why reasoned as why certain creation stories look similar between different cultures. Distinct from archetypes but similar in practice, Jung also mentions instincts, which are intuitions about how to act, isolated from other influences. For example, we don't ever need to witness someone eating to understand that we must eat to survive. This theory in its entirety, which is pure conjecture, could be summarized by saying that we do not give rise to ideas, but rather ideas give rise to us. We are simply manifestations of what exists within the collective. Now, there's an important distinction to be made. You'll often see the label collective unconsciousness used to describe situations like a hive mind or where thoughts are being shared actively among beings. However, that is technically a misuse and would be a collective conscious, not a collective unconscious. For it to be unconscious, we must not be aware of it. Most series, however, involve the unconscious becoming conscious, so we will witness a blurring of the lines there, and that means that analyzing them will require some conflation of the two concepts. There's more to cover related to this topic, but let's examine how this influences Serial Experiments Lain with just what we have now. It's undoubtedly an aspect of the anime, as it's directly mentioned in the script, like right here in the final episode.
People's memories aren't just personal, they're shared in the collective unconscious.
We'll get to memory in a moment, but it's best to first look at the basic premise of the series. I've talked about it many times now, so I'll be brief here today. The plot is really just Lain, a young girl who becomes increasingly involved in technology and conspiracy, witnessing and somewhat causing the breakdown of the barrier between humanity and the collective unconscious, facilitated by the rapid pace of technology, which in their world itself is the means to break down this barrier. In essence, making the collective unconscious into a collective consciousness. Since it's pushed along by technology, we see the middle stages of this development in the spooky vibes of the anime. When Lane is seeing messages on the board in class, or shadowy figures in the halls and streets, when there's melting power lines while she rides the train, or how she's hearing voices in her head, or any number of these other odd occurrences, it's a representation of this. These ideas and images which exist in the shared memory of humanity are spilling over into the real world, but somewhat unrecognizable as they take on horrific and unintelligible forms. The thoughts we harbor but refuse to speak are given form in this way. What others remember, she now remembers. What they saw, she sees. What they hear, she hears, and so on. If this sounds rather overwhelming, that's because it is. Lane is occasionally seen emerging from one of these abstract bouts showing signs of literal physical exhaustion without even mentioning the clear mental toll. We see more of this from others as well. In the second episode, we witness a man taking a new drug called Excella, which essentially speeds the brain up as if it were a hyper-advanced processor. In this state, he begins to go through something similar to Lane, losing a grip on what is conscious and what is unconscious. It's not directly defined for us, but his fear of Lane could possibly be due to the fact that memory is timeless in a collective unconscious. Since everything is shared and we're merely manifestations of it, when he's looking at our main character, he could be seeing not just another of her personalities as it seems, or his memories of another personality, something we'll return to later, but also her future actions, her powers, and more, since his sped up mind is likely more in tune with the collective. By the end of the anime, Lane can manipulate someone's memories within the unconscious as a timeless being. So even if she isn't doing so right now, the future her could be doing so, and now she's just witnessing it in person, which would be her forcing this man's hand from within his own connection to the unconscious. Overwhelmed and terrified by this, he screams,
"I just wanted to clear my head. It's got nothing to do with me. Just leave me out of it. Just leave me out of it. Just leave me out of it, will ya?"
Which covers more of why it's overwhelming. There is no way to be left out. Since we'd all be representations of this pool of knowledge, there's no opt-out. It's like parents. You can leave them, you can never talk to them again, but you can't change that you came from them. If the barrier broke down between these layers of consciousness, we'd be privy to every memory, every thought, every idea that ever existed or would exist. Think you could handle it being forced to see anything and everything all at once? Sort of like a bagel, huh? The technical main conflict of the anime is with Masami Iri, a programmer who inserted his consciousness into the wired, the term Serial Experiments Lain uses for the sum of connected devices akin to our internet. As such, he became sort of like a god within it. His goal is the breakdown between these two worlds, as he muses about evolution and humanity, stating,
"The information etched inside humans isn't only that which they themselves have acquired as individuals. If that information isn't shared, it's meaningless. It amounts to nothing more than data. People were connected to each other. All I've done is to return things to the way they once were."
Now, this is really just him stating the principle, but it raises an interesting question, and one of the reasons I think there's value in addressing these topics. We see how overwhelming a process this is, how dire its results can be not just on individuals but on the world. Yet it also provides us with the power to solve essentially any problem ever. Lane makes a world where Alice, one of her only real friends, gets the future she always seemed to want with her unlikely romantic interest. Maybe this could happen for everyone. If we somehow could, is this something we should do? And would it only work if it was just one person who could do so, like Lane, so that not everyone is interfering in the world at once? This is, in essence, asking if we should invent God. Let's throw logic out and assume the collective unconscious does exist for now. Wouldn't there be a reason why there's a barrier between us and it, whether we put it there or not? Would our limited minds be able to handle unlimited information? Lain likely only handles it because she is a product of the collective, and so disposed to being able to do so. Also, how would we use it? With all the knowledge ever, would we still have the same flaws we have as individual beings, and so just manipulate each other all at the same time? And these changes we make, even if they do make things better, are they actually affecting a real world or just our perceptions of one? If someone altered all of your memories right now, you'd be someone entirely different. However, you'd believe yourself to have always been that way because you have memories to prove it. And since we supposedly share those memories, the same effect would happen for everyone else with regards to you. We see some version of this when Lain erases her bad memories of her, and suddenly her friends who used to bully her, at least lightly, are now excited to be around her. We don't observe reality, we perceive it based on our own internal workings. If someone had access to those, we never know. So the moral question, is altering perception to make the issue go away correct? Wouldn't it be the same as hypnotizing someone in pain to simply ignore pain? I'll leave that question for you to speculate on below, both to help the engagement of this video because algorithmic overlord, but also because I'm fascinated by the subjectivity of ethics and really do want to see what you all come up with. Now, there's something else a collective would do, and that is provide more connection. This is undeniably a central theme of the anime as Lain explores a world growing increasingly devoid of it, something we covered in a full video all about its world-building loneliness. The story's start is Lain receiving an email from one of her classmates, Chisa, who chose to leave the world. That's actually the first scene we get, stating that she's now alive within the Wired and asking Lain to join her. I argue the reason Lain goes to such lengths and dives into technology is because it's the only time someone in her life is genuinely asking her to connect with them, as her family and friends clearly don't. This makes clear that her downfall is a result of the desperate search to find connection when there is none. Clearly, one point of the series is that connection is necessary, a fact we see repeated in the end as Alice stresses the basics of contact. But that raises a question. We see that things only go more wrong for Lain the more she's connected to everyone at all times, from the easier communication of the Wired to being directly part of the unconscious itself. But they seem to go better when she slows down and just connects in one person with one friend. So would this kind of collective connection be beneficial at all, or would it be too much, even though it seems to solve the issue of connection indefinitely? If our unconscious became conscious and was shared, we'd be aware of every thought everyone else was having, and had already had, and would ever have in their life. Originality itself would die, and there wouldn't be anything else left to make us distinct beings. Maybe that's part of the imagery of all the puppet lanes, just with different bodies and different clothes. Our limitations are what make us who we are. As I believe the fantastic anime Sunny Boy was saying, death, or the end of our beings, is all that solidifies us as ever having been our own thing. If we experienced everything, wouldn't we then all simply be the same? If you want more on that, check out the video on screen now. It's probably some of my greatest work to date. But this concept of, I guess we could call it the death of infinity, that may be part of why when Lain gains the ability to manipulate the collective, she's no longer witnessed in the world. After Lain erases her friends' memories of her less savory actions, she starts to see another of herself interacting happily with them, and later, as this progresses, she can stand in the middle of the classroom completely unobserved. She ceased to be an actual person and has simply become the information which exists between people, a thought, an idea. She knows they exist, but they cannot know she exists. She's just a concept in the minds of people. This may be the result of a total barrier breakdown, a homogeneous state where nothing will ever change again, because all that remains would be ideas and nothing to actually act on them. But maybe it's not like that. The answer may be in memories and how their individuality propagates. Let's assume information has to spread among the collective in some way, and not everything is known all at once in one instant, and examine Chisa's second life in that context. Once again, the series opens on her choice to leave the world, yet she's emailing Lain and other students saying she's actually alive in the Wired. When we get the context that the Wired is simply a means to break down the barrier between the conscious and unconscious worlds, I think we can explain how Chisa lives on. This relates back to, yes, I'm sorry to do it again, another video I made on Lain, where we covered how none of us are truly ourselves. There's what we believe to be ourselves, but oftentimes we aren't even sure of who we are internally, but there's also who we once were since we've all changed, who we'll become since we'll keep changing, as well as who we are in different situations like at work or at home, and who we are in the memory of others, how they remember us from those situations. We have access to our thoughts and thus our reasoning for actions, but no one else does. So they have to draw their own conclusions, leading to them having their own idea of who we are. You might have drank the last sip of that drink because you were thirsty, but maybe they thought you did it just because you were being selfish and didn't want them to have it. When you add in the internet, where our social circles expand and our information is available forever, we suddenly have almost infinite selves, from friends who know us well to strangers who only know us as a tweet. So what happens to those selves when our memories can interact with other people's as they may in a collective unconscious? Remember, we said there's no opt-out, you have to participate in it. Your thoughts are interacting with others, and so your memories are as well. Lain has a memory of Chisa like when they walked home together once, but her classmates don't have that memory, so their idea of Chisa is different. As such, these two memories would mix to form a more collective image of her, and that means that Chisa is still changing and growing as observed by others. And what is life but growth and change? It could become reasonable to consider her alive in this way. A new consciousness of Chisa emerges, one which is brought forth from every self but her original one, and due to this propagation, as well as the storage of information, she would achieve endless life as laid out in Serial Experiments Lain. See why I really wanted to cover this? As an analog to our world, with the internet acting as their Wired does, isn't there something similar in the works for us here right now? Humans have always persisted through memory. Great writers and painters and other creators relied on the memory created by their works and the fact that it was theirs being remembered as well to, well, be remembered. But outside of the major names, and they were often only rediscovered after their deaths, they were probably only locally known, and over time their works were forgotten to even be theirs. With the advent of more industrial technology, their work could be reproduced and shared more, so their memory grew. But people still had to choose to go out and buy it, choose to remember you. And now we reach our current modern age, where most of our work can reach infinite space in a matter of seconds. We're constantly seeing works we never chose to interact with and never will again, as well as engaging more vigorously than ever with the ones that we are choosing to engage with. Say I died tomorrow. My work, this image of me, would still be around. People would continue to engage with it for some time at least, and discussion of my words would propagate a memory of me, which mixed with others as they discussed to form a new me. Could we consider this being an unwilling consciousness? A sort of abstract life created without consent through the connection of other minds? The anime explores this further with rumors. It's never actually clear if Lain really does have... Nothing's clear in this series, Jesus Christ. But it's never actually clear if Lain really does have an evil self roaming around the Wired doing awful things. It could just be rumors that were believed, and due to them growing more numerous and varied, another consciousness emerged from those rumors as we laid out here. Like with Chisa, it's life being created or maintained in an abstract way. But what if this was on a wider scale? What if Lain is fully a being born from the collective unconscious, or an embodiment of it? The evidence for this is that she doesn't actually seem to hold important memories of her own. When asked if she could define anything about her family, her background, like birthdays, or if they ever celebrated them, or if her parents were actually her own, she fails to know, and they're revealed to have been acting the entire time later anyway. And despite this, she still has functional intuitions, like motor skills, which could be the instincts held within the collective. And then there's the fact that when she removes herself from the world to fix it, we also see that the breakdown between the layers has ceased, save her ability to come into and out of either, meaning that when she's gone, the connection to the collective is also gone. I think this is a decent pool of evidence to say that the barrier was breaking because she is the collective, or at least the embodiment of it. Rather than a conscious being, she may just be a collection of unconscious thoughts. You know that joke we all probably say something like, actually, I'm just a figment of your imagination? Well, it's basically that, but with everyone. Because of how fluid perception can be, how do we know that everyone actually exists? If some trickster god or some higher being like that put the memories of someone into the minds of a group of people and then brought those people together, would that imaginary person begin to exist? Playing on the concept we discussed with Chisa as well, would they then become conscious due to the interaction of memories concerning them? That's a horror story someone really should write, like a being being born from conscious recollection, just appearing at the door of a party and then being welcomed in as if they'd always existed, but we as the reader know they didn't. It's the same energy as when Lain is welcomed by her friends after rewriting their memories, but leaving Alice's intact. So Alice is left as the only person alive, knowing the real Lain, knowing what she did, knowing that the one standing right there isn't the person who used to exist, but everyone else greets them like nothing is wrong. It makes sense why Alice herself has a breakdown, because imagine carrying all of that alone. Let's return to the overwhelming nature of Serial Experiments Lain for a moment, though. For the characters, as we already discussed, but also for us. The series throws copious amounts of information at us, a representation of Lain's exploration and journey through the Wired. We see how much she's taking in and struggle to do so ourselves as the series throws completely abstract visuals and audio and everything at us at once. And it's made worse by the fact that in these scenes of chaos, we don't know what's useful and what isn't. For example, in this span, there's talk of a man asking someone out, which never occurs, but also a woman mentioning a small figure in a striped shirt watching her, which we do see happen later on. Turns out it might actually be Lain. They're all talking over each other, forming a constant stream of unmanaged information that takes over without consent. Anonymous forms, deception and active lies, rumors and threats, the Wired is anything and everything all at once. Kind of like an everything bagel. It's both a mirror for the Wired's functionality of bringing the collective closer, and to our own real-world internet, which was just gaining widespread adoption around the time of Serial Experiments Lain airing. I could rehash what I said in, yes, repeat after me, a previous video about the series, about how it was right and wrong, but I want to instead address if our internet is itself a parallel to the supposed collective unconscious. As in, did we start inventing it ourselves? Just as we see in the anime, it's a method for us to share our thoughts with the rest of the world almost instantaneously, in a sometimes anonymous and unfiltered way. While we have some choice in the matter, both in terms of selecting what we share and also what we see, it isn't fully a choice. Since the internet is essentially required for modern life, we'll be subject to the thoughts of others shared with us as we try to navigate the internet for its necessary utility. It also functions as a well of information. Returning to the anime for one moment, its progression into technology is exceedingly quick, as she goes from dusting off an old computer and never checking her email, to being a hacker genius in a super short period of time. This shocks even her technophile father, leaving him utterly speechless. It seems unreasonable to say that she'd be able to gain all of this knowledge so quickly, but could that be a point in favor of collective? Lain may have met the conditions for an archetype which held that information, and so it became like an instinct to her, guiding her behavior and allowing her rapid pace with minimal overhead. After all, under this theory, everything pretty much already exists, we're just pulling from that well. It's once again not at the same level, but isn't our world much more like this than ever? 30 years ago, I would have had to go to the library, hope they had writings on Freud and Jung, find the correct ones and all of that, read them to be able to speak on all of this, and then return them, and there's a lot of steps. Now I can simply search collective unconscious from my own personal space and have the information collected and summarized from there, passed along from others, and shared with me. You could look up how to tie a tie, how to beat Pokemon Emerald with only one snow runt, the digits of pi, how to say the terrible children in French, Tom Cruise's actual height, the number of catches Pickens made last season, a completely incongruent and unadulterated flow of any and all information one could want at any time. The only difference between this and a collective unconscious is the medium to communicate between the two layers. Say that one day we could access the internet with our brains alone. Wouldn't that be like a shared consciousness? And what would we do if it became overwhelming and we could no longer opt out? I don't believe a collective consciousness exists, but I think it is important to ask what would happen if we ever made one. After all, to quote Ghost in the Shell, if man realizes technology is within reach, he achieves it like it's damn near instinctive. And it is somewhat eerie that the tendency of our modern evolution is towards such a thing, similar to what Eerie claims about the evolution of man needing the next leap. But again, I don't believe this is the anime being prophetic, it's really just it having a fantastic grasp on human nature. The digital consciousness has had many good effects, but undoubtedly we'd see negatives to the overflow of information, and the anime doesn't shy away from this either. Earlier in the anime, Lain is investigating deaths related to an MMO dungeon crawler game called Phantoma sweeping across the wired. Mostly undefined, we see a bit of gameplay from it, but all we know is that it's popular with kids and something odd is happening within it. While trying to uncover what, Lain witnesses a young player running beer from an even younger girl before madly opening fire on her with what seems to be an in-game weapon. Afterwards, he's curled up on the roof alone, surrounded by what could be bodies, as he remarks not knowing it was a little girl, and that he was simply acting on the fact he was scared. It turns out, Phantoma was crossing over with a children's tag game, leading to this confusion. But even deeper, Phantoma itself is supposedly a revival of research into the psychic power of children, which was thought to be destroyed years before, after costing the test subjects their lives. But it's dug up from the internet and recreated by a mysterious group known as the Knights. And also, it may explain the odd occurrences in the prior episodes involving children witnessing supernatural events, as their connection to the collective is more awoken. When they're lifting their arms up to an image of Lain in the sky, they may be becoming one with the collective unconscious she embodies. But most interesting about all this to me is how the mental state like those of the player we witness are manipulated. He was trying to leave the game but couldn't, and through induction of fear he was made to do something he normally wouldn't, and then regretted. The Wired altered his actions and the real-world consequences of them. What these projects are doing is akin to brainwashing these children, and this is a result of the spread of information in an unchecked way, and how we interact with it, how it can be hidden and obscured to seem like something else. These children didn't consent to the actions they now perform, they didn't know this game was an experiment. Would this be the same in the collective unconsciousness if it was achieved? How would we tell emotions apart from memories? How would we tell fact apart from fiction? Is there some internal designation that marks them as distinct? Or would we begin to confuse fact and fiction and emotion and memories as every single mind interacts with every other one? This is the parallel to our internet once more because we're already seeing the blurring of that line. One of the hardest parts of what I do is research because it grows harder and harder to verify if sources are supplying correct information. Even if an article cites sources, how do you know that those sources themselves aren't flawed? And then if you find articles that are all citing the same source, which is wrong, then misinformation just spreads further than any actual information. And with our limited attention spans, we're not going to read the 90-page paper, we're going to read the 5-minute article. And then anyone can make a claim and share it online. And to be fair, that's basically just what Freud and Jung did. Without much basis, they just started saying things, and so people believed them because they talked loud enough. So how would this function when all thoughts are shared without a third party, essentially mind-to-mind communication? If we all merged consciousness right now, the factual information would exist within all of us, so we would have the right answer. But only somewhere? because all of the wrong information would also be present, and most of us are novices on more things than we're experts on. Imagine that 11 minds merge. One of them correctly believes that Serial Experiments Lain came out in 1998, while the other 10 believe it came out in 2002. Unless the collective has some kind of internal fact check, wouldn't 10 voices outweigh 1? Suddenly, Lain would have come out in 2002. Fact would just be rewritten. I bring this up in relation to Phantoma because it is functionally the same concept when we add the next logical step. What then happens when we start acting on this information? When our emotions are manipulated through falsehoods, doesn't that mean we're sort of like acting out the will of another being? Similar to our example of memories being replaced, none of us can prove at any point that we aren't brainwashed, because all evidence against it could be claimed to be part of the brainwashing. If there really was a Lain scenario where one person or a handful of people like the Knights gained power over the unconscious, we'd be entirely screwed and not even know it. If it existed, that is. And this section deserves a note. Just because fact is harder to find sometimes now doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There's peer-reviewed scientific papers from credible scientists or government-supplied information that doesn't have clear conflicts of interest to sway it, or analysis from experts from official and trusted sources with a good reputation. Mis and disinformation can be combated, especially if we're careful. And the idea that we're brainwashed is merely an example based on the conjecture of these two men. In a time where idiots are claiming that children are somehow being brainwashed by drag shows and equitable teachings, it's important to say that yes, that idea is exceptionally stupid, and yes, if you believe it, you are exceptionally stupid too. Wow, okay, this was originally supposed to be one single video covering these topics in classic anime, and I'm only about halfway through everything only one of them has to say on it. I guess Serial Experiments Lain is going to get split into 2 videos, but I think the second one will also cover the conspiracy side of the anime, with the influences on and history of that as well, including something I really want to talk about, which is the idea that we may all simply be tools in the consciousness of a greater being. But I'll save that video for after the series moves on to other anime, if you'd like to see more, that is. I'm going to be rewatching Evangelion in the background to prepare either way, I think. So let's end with a bit more of the concrete Jungian influence on the anime, rather than our own conjecture based on his conjecture. This is where we reach more of the Jungian archetypes, those specific ideas from the collective unconscious that we embody. They supposedly dictate our behavior based on the correct circumstances, and given Lain is more in tune with the collective than anyone else, this could be the reason for her sudden swaps. Throughout the anime, you'll notice her speech and personality change drastically on a dime. This may be the moment she comes to embody an archetype given the right situation. Helping this along is the fact that her multiple personalities themselves may be archetypes. The number of them is unlimited, and Jung seemed to essentially add them whenever he felt like and gave special attention to some over others, leading to ones often called the Big Four. The anima or animus, which is in reference to masculinity, femininity, and their relation to each other, the persona, which is our mask in social situations, the self, which is normally unmanifested but represents the balancing of personality, and the shadow, which is the repressed impulses we hold that are unaccepted by ourselves or society. Clearly, Lain's trickster side would be a representation of this last one, the shadow. Since the line between consciousness and unconsciousness is blurring, her unaccepted desires and traits are spilling out in the world and causing chaos. She doesn't remember doing these things because it's unconscious, they're happening due to the breakdown. Jung didn't believe the shadow was entirely negative, however. A balancing and understanding of it, rather than denial or repression, could lead to positive results. This brings us to the persona, however, the face we want others to see in contrast to the shadow. Since it includes the expectations and standards of others, it isn't fully us, rather sort of a representation or molding of us, and this he believed could have harmful effects when in excess. If one becomes entirely consumed by their persona, they may undergo disintegration, where the persona itself breaks down. This then had 3 apparent routes of response. negative restoration, which is akin to playing pretend and trying to return to the previous state, absence, where one lives without a persona and as such can't communicate to the world, and restoration, which is developing a conscious persona that doesn't hide oneself. I think this is actually where they developed the pattern for Lane's journey itself. She's at first consumed by her persona when she alters her entire being to find connection, i.e. fitting in with others and their expectations. This leads her to undergo disintegration, where she first attempts negative restoration, denying the truth of her other parts and wanting to remain as the persona she had. Proved wrong, however, she responds with absence. Another explanation for why she was able to exist unperceived, like standing in her classroom, may be this, as without a persona, she physically couldn't communicate with other beings. And finally, she undergoes restoration, developing a true self which appears to embody all of her personalities. The final Lane we see is more confident, but not quite snarky and outgoing like her evil side, cautious but also somewhat more friendly, as if they'd all come together into one. This is backed up by the vision of her father, saying,
"You don't have to wear that ever again. Do you understand?"
in reference to her bear pajamas as well. Given it's confirmed that this outfit was included in the anime as the representation of a more timid Lane, given its own voice direction notes as well, we can consider it as hard evidence that she's consolidating her personalities. And this would be another Jungian concept involving the self, that often unmanifested archetype called individuation. This is supposedly the uniting and balancing of the internal personality structures normally at odds. He explained that this process was the ultimate, yet impossible goal of existence, because it would require one to make the unconscious mind conscious. But for our story, it lines up perfectly with Lane's ending, as she alone seemingly balances her personality, becomes one with the unconscious, and acts as God due to this. Wow, okay, I'm sorry the ending of this one was more or less just stating the influences of the anime, but there really was so much to cover, and I didn't want to just keep repeating myself as these topics blended together. I hope it was still worthwhile. I often wonder if presenting these topics with the goal of simply encouraging thought and reflection is doing enough, which is why my videos get longer and longer. As I grow as a creator and cover more and more and become more of an expert on these topics, each one seems less original and so like it needs more and more detail to be impactful. But I still enjoy it either way, and I hope you did as well, and we'll show it for this little series of videos. I honestly really do wish I could just make a single 3-hour-long movie on this topic and release it, but that would take too much time and risk to do so right now. So we'll have to settle for segments. Comments, likes, and shares will really help boost this video's chances with the almighty YouTube gods, so I want them for that reason, but I am fully genuine when I leave open questions in these videos for you to discuss in the comments. What did you think of these topics and how did you react to them? That's what I'm already sharing with you. That's why I said at the start it would be fitting. Together, that discussion will create its own thoughts and new ideas and sort of like its own collective consciousness of sorts under this video, which makes me much happier than it should to know that we can kind of make that concept. And as always, remember, Freud and Jung's ideas are just conjecture we went over for the sake of thought, and they shouldn't be taken as genuine psychological concepts. But I'll stop taking up more of your time here and let you know there's 3 links in the pinned comment to Twitter, Discord, and Patreon, where the lovely people above me help me keep putting out absolutely mad stuff like this. So big thanks to them, but big thanks to everyone as always for your time. And I'll just say thank you for watching. I hope to see you again soon.